The day Harriet Merriweather walked into the land office in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1874, every man in that dusty room stopped what he was doing and stared, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she had the kind of look in her eyes that told you she had already survived something that would have broken most people in half. She was 31 years old, dressed in a faded black morning dress that had seen better days, her brown hair pinned back in a practical knot beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to her late husband, Robert. The hat was too large and sat slightly askew on her head, and she had not bothered to fix it, because she had other things on her mind. Bigger things. The sort of things that kept a woman awake at 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling of a boarding house room she could no longer afford to rent past the end of the month. She set her papers down on the counter in front of the land agent, a round-faced man named Gerald Hooper who smelled of pipe tobacco and breakfast biscuits, and she said, without any preamble whatsoever, that she wanted to file a homestead claim. Gerald Hooper looked at her papers. Then he looked at her. Then he looked back at the papers. "Mrs. Merriweather," he said slowly, the way a man speaks when he is choosing his words carefully because he is a coward who does not want to say the honest thing, "you are aware that under the Homestead Act, a widow does qualify as head of household and may file a claim." He paused. However what, Mr. Hooper?" Harriet said. It was not a question. It was a warning. "However," he continued, sliding one particular deed across the counter toward her, "the only parcel remaining in the valley with enough acreage for viable homesteading is this one. Section 14. He tapped the paper with one thick finger. "And I have to tell you, ma'am, that this land has been passed over by every single settler who has come through this office in the last 3 years. It is rocky. It sits on limestone shelf in several places. The soil where it is not rocky is clay-heavy and drains poorly. The creek that crosses the eastern edge runs dry by midsummer most years." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as though delivering a confession. 3 different families tried to work that ground. 2 left inside of a year. The third one, a Harmon family out of Missouri, their father died of exhaustion inside of 8 months. His widow packed up the children and went back east. Harriet listened to all of this without blinking. When he was finished, she pulled the deed closer and looked at it herself, studying the survey lines with the focused attention of a woman who had been taught to read maps by a father who had believed his daughter deserved to understand the world she lived in. "What is the asking price under the filing fee?" she said. $14 for the filing. You must improve the land and reside on it for 5 years before full title transfers, as per the Act." "But Mrs. Merriweather, given what I have just told you, I heard what you told me," she said. She reached into the small leather purse she kept tucked against her side, and she counted out $14 in coins, setting each one down on the counter with a quiet, deliberate click. "I would like to file the claim." Gerald Hooper looked at the coins. He looked at her face. He picked up the coins and wrote her name in the ledger. Harriet Merriweather walked out of that office into the bright Kansas afternoon with a claim deed for 160 acres of the hardest land in the Cimarron Valley, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like herself again. She had come to Caldwell 6 weeks earlier with her son, James, who was 9 years old and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn streak in equal measure. Robert Merriweather had died the previous autumn of a fever that had swept through their small farm in Indiana like a judgment. He had been 35 years old. He had been a decent man and a fair husband, though not a passionate one, and Harriet had grieved him truly, but grief had not paralyzed her. What had nearly paralyzed her was the debt he had left behind, the mortgage on the Indiana farm that had been underwater for 2 years before he died, the creditors who had come around with their hats in their hands and their eyes on everything she owned. She had sold what she could, packed what she could carry, and brought herself and her son west, because west was where a person went when everything behind them had been stripped down to the bone. She had heard about the Homestead Act from a woman on the train, a sharp-eyed Norwegian widow named Astrid who had already done it herself, had already built something on the prairie with her own 2 hands and the help of her teenage sons, and who had told Harriet over a shared meal of salt pork and cold biscuits that the land did not care whether you were a man or a woman, it only cared whether you were willing to work. Harriet had taken that to heart. Now she walked back to the boarding house where James was waiting, and she sat down beside him on the narrow bed and spread the deed across her knees and showed it to him. "That is ours," she said. James studied the deed with the serious attention of a boy who had been too close to too much adult trouble for too long. "It says the creek runs dry," he said. "Who told you that?" "I was listening when you came in. The walls here are thin." Harriet looked at her son for a long moment, then she pulled him close and pressed a kiss to the top of his head. "The creek runs dry by midsummer," she said. "That means we have all spring and early summer to water what needs watering, and we will dig a well." "Do you know how to dig a well?" "I will learn," she said. The next morning, she rented a wagon and a mule from the livery at the edge of town, and loaded what little she had 2 trunks of clothing and household goods, a small crate of tools she had purchased with the last of her money, a sack of seed corn she had carried all the way from Indiana because the variety had been her mother's, and she could not bring herself to leave it behind. And she and James drove out along the valley road towards Section 14. It was a beautiful morning, clear and cool, with the grass still holding the silver of the night dew, and the sky that particular shade of blue that exists only in the middle of the country, where there is nothing between you and the horizon for 50 miles in any direction. The valley spread out on either side of the road in a wide, shallow bowl, and she could see the other homesteads already established along the better land, the ones with the good loam and the reliable water, their small houses and barns already taking shape against the landscape. Section 14 was at the far end of the valley, where the land began to slope upward toward a limestone ridge. She saw immediately what Gerald Hooper had meant. The ground was strewn with rocks of varying sizes, great slabs of gray limestone pushing up through the thin topsoil like the bones of some ancient creature. The eastern edge, where the creek ran, was thick with cottonwood and willow, the trees gnarly and stunted from years of intermittent water, but alive. The rest of the land was a patchwork of rocky outcroppings and shallow basins where the clay soil had baked hard in previous droughts. Harriet stood in the middle of it with her hands on her hips and her hat still sitting slightly crooked, and she looked at it all very carefully for a long time. James stood beside her. "It is bad," he said. "It is difficult," she corrected. "Those are not the same thing." She spent the rest of that day marking where the house would go, in a slight hollow that would give some shelter from the worst of the north wind, and beginning to clear the ground of the nearest rocks. It was brutal work. Some of the stones were so large she could not move them at all and had to work around them, and by evening her hands were bleeding through the gloves she had worn thin, and her back ached in a way that told her she would not sleep easily. But she had cleared a space 30 feet by 30 feet, and she had stacked the rocks she had moved into a rough wall on the northern edge of the cleared ground, and when the sun went down, she sat on one of those stacked rocks and ate the cold supper she had packed and watched the stars appear over the valley one by one. She thought about Robert, not with grief exactly, but with a kind of honest tenderness, the way you think about someone once the sharpest edge of loss has passed. She thought about how different this was from anything he had ever imagined for them. She thought about her mother's seed corn in the crate in the wagon. She thought about the 5 years stretching ahead of her like the ground she had just been clearing, rocky and difficult and entirely hers. She did not let herself think about whether she could do it. She rolled herself and James into their blankets under the wagon that night, because there was no shelter yet, and she listened to the prairie sounds, the crickets and the distant coyotes and the wind moving through the cottonwood along the creek, and she slept better than she had in months. The sun came up and she was already awake, standing at the edge of the cleared ground with a cup of coffee made over the small fire she had built, when she heard hoofbeats on the road. A man rode up on a gray horse, a big animal, well kept, with a calm eye. The man himself was perhaps 35 or 36, lean but broad through the shoulders, with dark brown hair going slightly silver at the temples, a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, and eyes the color of good creek water, gray-green and clear. He wore a working man's clothes, a canvas coat gone soft with use, plain trousers, boots that had seen considerable mileage, and a hat that fit him properly, unlike her own. He had a bedroll tied behind his saddle and a pair of saddlebags that looked heavy. He stopped at the edge of her cleared ground and looked at the land around him with the look of a man who has been somewhere before and recognizes every detail of it. Then he looked at her. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Harriet said. "You filed a claim on this section." "I did," she said. "Yesterday afternoon." He nodded slowly, still looking around at the landscape with that particular expression she could not entirely read. "I know every inch of this soil," he said, and his voice was not boastful, just factual, the way a man states a thing he knows to be true. "I have spent the better part of 3 years working this valley, including considerable time on this parcel." He looked back at her. "I tried to buy it twice and was told both times the title was in dispute. Turns out it was just Gerald Hooper sitting on it to try to consolidate a larger purchase for a cattle operation." Harriet absorbed this. "Is that why you are here?" she said carefully. "To tell me the land should be yours?" "No," he said, and there was something immediate and honest in the way he said it. "It is not mine. You filed the claim. That is the law, and I respect it." He swung down off the gray horse in a single easy movement and held out his hand. "Theodore Easton. I worked survey crews through this valley in 71 and 72. And before that I had a small operation on the south end cattle before the drought of 69 broke it up." She shook his hand. "Harriet Merriweather." "I know," he said. "Gerald Hooper has a loud voice and thin walls." Something almost like a smile crossed her face. "My son said the same thing about this morning." Theodore Easton looked past her at James, who had emerged from under the wagon and was standing a careful distance away, watching this exchange with the serious, measuring attention that had become his default mode somewhere in the middle of the hard year that had passed. "Your boy," Theodore said. "James," Harriet said. "He is 9. Theodore gave James a nod of the sort that acknowledged him as a person rather than a child to be spoken around, and James nodded back with the dignity of someone who appreciated being treated accordingly. "Mrs. Merriweather," Theodore said, turning back to her, "I came out here this morning because I heard what you filed and I wanted to offer my help. Not charity, not pity." He said the last 2 words with a precision that told her he understood these things would not be welcome. "I know what this land will do and what it will not. I know where the water runs underground because I helped survey the well locations when they were trying to establish this section in 71. I know which of these rocks can be split and used for building, and which ones are bedded so deep you cannot move them. I know that the clay in the southern basin, if you mix it with the sand from the creek bed and the limestone dust from the split rock, makes a decent building material." He paused. "I have nowhere particular to be for the next few months. My surveying contract does not resume until fall. I am offering to help you get started, in exchange for honest wages when you can afford them, and in the meantime, room and board which I understand will be rudimentary." Harriet looked at him for a long moment. She was not a woman who accepted help easily. She had been raised by a self-sufficient father in a self-sufficient family, and life with Robert, who had been a proud man in his way, had not softened that instinct. But she was also not a fool. She was one woman and a 9-year-old boy on 160 acres of the worst land in the valley, with no shelter yet, no well, no crop in the ground, and the planting window closing around her like a slow door. "You said honest wages," she said. "I do not have much." "Whatever is fair when the time comes," he said. "I mean that simply." She looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had worked outdoors his whole life, calloused and strong, with a particular kind of steadiness about them. She looked at his eyes again and found in them nothing evasive, nothing that made her instincts warn her away. "All right, Mr. Easton," she said. "We start with the well." He smiled then, a real smile that changed his whole face, and reached back into his saddlebags and pulled out a rolled map. "I brought the survey notes," he said. They made an unlikely team, the three of them, through that first week. Theodore knew the land the way he said he did, with a thoroughness that went beyond book knowledge into something almost physical, the way a person knows a place they have walked over 100 times in all weathers and all lights. He showed her where the survey had found the best water at 18 feet below the surface, in a location she would never have chosen herself, slightly uphill from where she had instinctively thought to dig. He showed her which rocks split cleanly along the grain with the right kind of chisel strike, and which ones would only shatter uselessly. He showed her where the clay in the southern basin was workable, and where it was too alkaline to bind properly. He worked from sunup to sundown without complaining, and without making her feel obligated to be grateful, which she appreciated more than almost anything. He simply worked, and expected her to work alongside him, which she did, and the equality of that daily labor was something she had not quite experienced before and found unexpectedly sustaining. James took to him with a careful, measured trust that was the most a boy in his situation could offer. He did not shadow Theodore the way a lonely child might shadow a kind adult, but he watched, and he asked questions, and Theodore answered them with the same honest directness he used with Harriet, without condescension or falseness. James had a sharp mind and asked sharp questions about the geology of the limestone, about the principles of surveying, about how you read the lie of the land to predict where water would run. Theodore answered all of it, sometimes at considerable length, and Harriet would find herself pausing in her work to listen to these conversations, watching her son's face open up in the way it had not opened since before Robert got sick. The well came first. They dug for 3 days, Theodore and Harriet trading off with the pick and the shovel while James worked the rope and bucket, hauling the broken earth up in loads. On the second day, they hit the first hard layer of limestone, and Theodore showed her how to set a chisel and use the weight of the hammer in a particular rhythm that broke through the rock efficiently. Her arms ached to the bone by evening of the second day, but she learned the rhythm and kept it, and by the afternoon of the third day they hit water at 17 feet, 1 foot shallower than the survey had predicted, and the water came up clear and cold and tasted of limestone, and it was the best thing she had ever put in her mouth. James actually cheered when the first bucket came up dark with water from the bottom, and Theodore laughed, a full, genuine laugh that startled a pair of meadowlarks out of the grass 30 yards away. Harriet had not heard him laugh before that moment, and the sound of it was something she filed away without entirely meaning to, the way you file away something surprising that you want to think about later. The house took considerably longer. Theodore's idea for using the split limestone and the clay mix proved sound, and they built low walls, 18 inches thick, that would hold the summer heat out and the winter cold at bay better than the thin board walls of most homestead houses. The work was slow because cutting and fitting stone is slow, patient work, and Harriet had never done it before and had to learn from the ground up, quite literally. But she was a good learner. Theodore told her this toward the end of the second week. In the plain, factual way he said most things, and the compliment landed differently than compliments usually did, because it was not about how she looked or how brave she was for a woman in her circumstances. It was simply an observation about a specific skill, and she valued it accordingly. The days fell into a rhythm. Up before dawn, fire and coffee, and a brief, practical exchange about what needed to happen that day. Work until the light failed. A simple supper cooked over the fire, then sitting by it afterward in the cool spring evenings, while James did the reading lessons Harriet insisted on regardless of how tired everyone was, and then sleep. Theodore had set up his bedroll at the far edge of the cleared ground with the easy propriety of a man who understood the importance of correct appearances, and Harriet respected him for not having to be asked. She began to know things about him in the way you know a person you work alongside every day, not through formal conversation, but through the accumulation of small observed details. He was patient but not passive. He had opinions, clear ones, and he stated them directly, but he did not push them when she disagreed. He simply laid his reasoning out and let her make up her own mind. He had a habit of going still and quiet when he was thinking through a problem, the way some people pace. He went still, and in those moments of stillness there was something about the quality of his attention that she found curiously comforting, as though his very presence steadied the air around her. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, one of 5 children on a small farm, and that he had come west at 19 following the end of the war, the tail end of it catching him before he was quite old enough to be properly conscripted. He had done a number of things since then: ranch work, surveying, a brief and apparently disastrous attempt at running a freight business between Wichita and Dodge City. He talked about his life without self-pity and without inflation, which was rarer than it should have been. She told him things about herself too, in the evening conversations, more than she had intended, more than she had told anyone since Robert died. She told him about her father's farm in Ohio, about how she had learned to read maps and surveys from him, about the years in Indiana, about Robert's illness and death, and the stripping away of everything that had followed. She told it plainly, without performing grief or performing strength, just telling it as it had been, and Theodore listened with that quality of stillness that told her he was hearing all of it, every word. One evening toward the end of April, nearly 3 weeks after Theodore had first ridden up to her cleared ground on his gray horse, the two of them were sitting by the fire after James had gone to sleep in the corner of the partially built house under a canvas lean-to, and the conversation had reached one of those quiet pauses that had become comfortable between them, the sort of pause that does not need filling. Theodore was looking at the fire and Harriet was looking at the stars, and then without looking at him she said, "Why did you really come out here that morning?" He was quiet for a moment. Fire crackled and a coyote called somewhere out on the dark prairie, and the cottonwoods along the creek made their soft, papery sound in the night breeze. "I told you the truth," he said. "I know this land. I did not want to see it wasted." "That is not all of it," she said. She had not meant to say it, but she had been thinking it for some time. He looked at her then, and in the firelight his eyes were warmer than she had seen them in daylight, the gray-green gone deep and amber-edged. "No," he said honestly. "It is not all of it." He looked back at the fire. "I heard Gerald Hooper tell you what the land was, every worst thing about it, and I heard you put your $14 down on his counter anyway, 1 coin at a time." He paused. "I thought that was the most determined thing I had ever heard a person do." Harriet was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. "It was mostly desperation," she said. "It did not sound like desperation," Theodore said. "It sounded like choice." She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and for a moment the fire between them felt very small, the distance between where they sat very short, and something shifted in the air that neither of them acknowledged or moved toward. But it was there. They both knew it was there. "Good night, Mr. Easton," she said, and stood. "Good night, Mrs. Merriweather," he said, and the way he said her name held something careful in it, something deliberately kept in its proper place. She lay in her bedroll that night with her eyes open for a long time. The next morning everything was the same and also subtly different in a way that neither of them could have articulated precisely, but that both of them felt. The work was the same. The rhythm was the same. But there was a new quality of awareness between them, something that showed itself only in the small moments. The way their hands came close when passing tools and pulled back with a fraction more care. The way his eyes would find her across the work site and hold there a second longer than necessary. The way she sometimes caught herself watching him lift a heavy stone into place and had to consciously redirect her attention to her own work. The walls of the house went up through May, slow and steady as a tide coming in. The roof was a greater challenge. And Theodore spent 2 days talking her through the logic of it, how to cut the timber for the ridge beam from the cottonwood along the creek and season it enough not to warp badly, how to set the angle of the rafters to shed both rain and the rare heavy Kansas snow, how to lay the sod over the timber frame in thick overlapping sections that would insulate and seal. The finished roof was not beautiful, but it was solid, and the first evening they lit a lantern inside the 4 completed walls. The light filled the space and made it real, made it home. James, who had been patient and steady through all of it with a maturity that sometimes made Harriet's heart ache for how much this boy had had to grow up, walked around the single room of the house touching the walls with both hands, and then he sat down in the middle of the packed earth floor and looked up at the sod roof and said, "It does not let the sky in." "That is generally the point," Theodore said, from where he was standing in the doorway. "Our place in Indiana had a crack in the roof for 2 years," James said. "You could see the stars through it from my bed." "Did you mind?" Theodore said. James considered this. "No," he said, "but Mama did." Harriet laughed, which surprised her, because it was a genuine laugh, not a polite one, the kind of laugh that comes up from somewhere below the ribs, and she could not remember the last time she had laughed like that, and the sound of it surprised all 3 of them into a moment of bright, shared pleasure. Theodore was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one where he was carefully not letting himself show too much of what he was feeling but was not quite succeeding, and she found herself looking back at him with what she suspected was a very similar expression. And James, 9 years old and sharp as a new fence post, looked between the 2 of them with the calm, interested observation of a boy who was beginning to understand things about adults that he had not understood before. He said nothing about it, but he smiled, privately, in the direction of the wall. The corn went in the 2nd week of May, later than she would have liked but not too late for the variety, which her mother had always said was forgiving. The ground they had cleared of rocks and broken with the mule-drawn plow was the southern basin, where the clay had been amended with the creek sand, and the composted material Theodore had shown her how to pile and turn. It was hard plowing even so, the clay wanting to clump and stick, and they worked the plow together, Harriet walking the mule and Theodore breaking up the worst of the clods by hand behind her, until the rows were as straight and clean as they were going to get. Planting was the kind of work Harriet had known all her life, and there was a deep, bone-remembered pleasure in it, the reach and press of each seed into the earth, the smell of the turned soil, the sound of James dropping seeds into holes ahead of her and counting them under his breath to make sure of the spacing. Theodore planted alongside her without crowding her, taking the far rows, moving with an efficiency that told her he had done this kind of work before, which surprised her slightly. She had thought of him more as a man of stone and water than of growing things. "You know planting," she said, when they met at the end of a row. "I grew up on a farm," he said, with a slight smile. "Though I have not planted much since I left Missouri." "Do you miss it?" she said. "The farming?" He thought about it, genuinely thought about it rather than giving the easy answer. "I miss the idea of something that stays put," he said at last. "Survey work, you are always moving on. You map a place and then you leave it for someone else to settle. I have been to more good pieces of land than I can count and never stayed anywhere long enough for it to matter." She looked at him over the turned earth, and the afternoon light was long and golden on the valley, and the newly planted rows of her mother's corn seed lay between them like a kind of promise. "Do you want it to matter?" she said, very quietly. The question was larger than either of them was quite ready to acknowledge directly, and they both understood that. Theodore looked at the ground, then at her, and there was something in his face that was not quite ready to be spoken yet, a fullness that had not yet found its words. "I think I am beginning to," he said. There was a man in the valley named Calhoun Marsh, who ran a cattle operation on the north end, a big man with a florid face, and the kind of entitlement that comes from having been successful long enough to forget that it was ever otherwise. He had wanted Section 14 for his grazing expansion and had been working with Gerald Hooper, apparently, to keep it out of homesteader hands. When he heard that Harriet had filed a claim on it, he rode out to see for himself. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late May when Theodore was at the creek checking the water level, and Harriet was alone at the house mixing mortar for a final section of wall that needed pointing. Marsh rode up with one of his hired men and did not get down off his horse, which was a deliberate choice, a way of establishing hierarchy before a word was spoken. "Mrs. Merriweather," he said, with a surface politeness that had no warmth under it. "I understand you have filed a claim on this section." "That is correct," Harriet said. She did not stop working. "I want you to understand," Marsh said, "that this land is not suitable for farming. I have known men twice your size in Constitution fail on this ground. A woman alone." "I am not alone," Harriet said evenly. "That man Easton, yes, I heard." Marsh's voice carried a careful, measured contempt. "He will not stay. Men like Easton do not stay anywhere." Harriet set down her mortar trowel and turned to look at Marsh fully for the first time, and her voice when she spoke was very quiet and very clear. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "I have filed a legal claim on this land under the Homestead Act of 1862. I intend to improve it, work it, and reside on it for the required 5 years. What you or anyone else thinks of my Constitution is of no interest to me." She paused. "If you have a legal grievance regarding this claim, you are welcome to take it to the land office. If you do not, then I will ask you to remove yourself from my property." Marsh stared at her for a long moment, a flush creeping up his thick neck. His hired man looked at the ground. Then Marsh pulled his horse around and rode off without another word. Theodore appeared from the direction of the creek a few minutes later, and she told him what had happened, keeping her voice steady and the telling brief. Theodore listened with his jaw tight and his eyes harder than she usually saw them. "Marsh is not above using other methods when the polite ones fail," he said. "I know," she said. "I have dealt with men like him before." "Not out here," he said, and his voice carried a careful weight, not doubting her but wanting her to understand the specific nature of the risk. "Out here it is more isolated and the law is slower." "Then we will need to be prepared," she said. "Not frightened, prepared." He looked at her for a long moment, and then something in his face settled, a kind of decision made without being spoken. "All right," he said. "Then we will be prepared." He did not leave after that in the way Marsh had predicted. He stayed, and there was a different quality to his presence after that, something more definite, as though the threat had crystallized something in him that had previously been held in ambiguity. He began spending more of his evenings teaching James the basics of the surveying work, the use of a level and a compass, the principles of triangulation, and James absorbed all of it with a veracity that was something beautiful to watch. He repaired the fence line on the eastern boundary of the claim with the systematic thoroughness of a man who was establishing something permanent, not just building what was needed for the season. June came in hot and breathless, and the corn pushed up out of the clay-amended soil with a tentative, green determination that made Harriet press her hand to her mouth. The first morning she walked the rows and found the first thin green shoots breaking the surface. She had known intellectually that the corn would grow. Her mother's seed had always been reliable, but there was something about seeing it here, on this difficult, rocky, much-doubted land, that felt personal in a way she had not quite anticipated. Theodore came to stand beside her in the corn rows that morning, and they stood together looking at the thin green line of new growth. And neither of them said anything for a while, because the moment did not require words, and they had both learned over these weeks that they were capable of sharing silence without filling it. He was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth from him in the already warm morning air, and she was aware of it in the way that she had been increasingly aware of things about him that she was not quite ready to act on but could no longer honestly pretend were not there. The line of his shoulder, the way he pushed his hat back when he was thinking hard, the sound of his voice saying her name. Mrs. Merriweather still always with that precision that was respect and also something straining against the formal banks of it. "It is going to grow," she said of the corn. "Yes," he said, "it is." And she understood that they were both talking about more than corn, and she thought he understood it too, and the acknowledgement of that, even oblique, even unspoken, felt like something opening very slowly and very carefully in the center of her chest. The summer turned hard in July, as it always did on the Kansas plains, the heat settling over the valley like something with weight, the sky bleaching white at the edges from noon to 4 in the afternoon. The creek dropped to a trickle by the middle of the month, as Gerald Hooper had predicted it would, but the well held steady, cold and deep and reliable, and they rationed the water with the discipline of people who understood that water was the margin between survival and failure. The corn was 2 feet high and growing, an improbable small miracle in the middle of the dry heat, because Harriet carried water to the worst stressed sections every morning before the sun was fully up, bucket by bucket from the well, and the plants responded to this direct attention, the way all growing things respond to being attended to with care and consistency. It was during this stretch of hard July heat that things shifted between Harriet and Theodore, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of small, accumulated ones that together amounted to a crossing of some invisible line. It started with small things. The evening she came in from watering the corn exhausted past the point of her usual composure, her hair loose and her dress darkened with sweat, and sat down heavily on the stone step of the house and put her face in her hands, not crying, just breathing, just gathering herself. And Theodore came and sat beside her without a word and stayed there, a steady, unhurried presence at her side, until she lifted her head and found that his shoulder was almost against hers, and that the exhaustion had eased to something bearable. In the evening James asked Theodore to read to him from the small collection of books Harriet had packed from Indiana, because Harriet's voice was rough from a summer cold that had been nagging at her for a week, and Theodore had read aloud for an hour with a low, even voice that carried the story beautifully, and Harriet had sat across the room and watched his face in the lamplight as he read, and felt something so warm and definite in her chest that she had to look away. In the afternoon, a summer storm came rolling in from the northwest with the speed that Kansas storms come, the sky going green and black with a terrifying speed, and they had raced to get the mule inside the partial shelter of the barn they had built in June, and the rain had come down before they finished, and they had ended up standing together inside the barn doorway with the rain sheeting off the eaves in a solid gray curtain, both of them soaked through, both of them laughing from the simple animal relief of shelter. And Theodore had reached over and pushed the wet hair back from her forehead with one hand, a gesture so natural and so gentle that she had gone completely still, and his hand had stilled too, resting just at the edge of her hairline, and they had looked at each other in the dim, rain-loud barn with water dripping from both of them, and the space between them had been a breath, just a breath. He moved back first, quietly, not in retreat but in care, in the same kind of deliberate, precise care he brought to everything. "I apologize," he said very quietly. "You do not need to," she said equally quietly. They stood in the rain sound for another moment, and then she said, "Theodore," and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both felt the weight of it, the stepping across that it represented, and he looked at her with everything he had been keeping carefully banked suddenly much closer to the surface. "Harriet," he said, and her name in his voice was everything. It was the whole complicated, careful, slowly built thing between them. It was all of it compressed into 2 syllables. James appeared in the barn doorway behind them, soaking wet and cheerful about it. "The corn is going to get a good watering," he announced. The moment broke into something warm and relieved, and Harriet turned to her son with a laugh and Theodore turned to the horse with a smile. He did not quite hide in time, and the 3 of them waited out the storm in the good smell of wet earth and hay. That evening, after James was asleep, They sat outside the house door on the stone step because the air after the storm was sweet and cool, the first real relief in weeks, and the stars were very clear over the valley. And Theodore said, without preamble, without particular ceremony, "I do not want to leave here." Harriet held very still. "I have been trying to talk myself into leaving," he said, "because the honest thing, the clear thing, is to say out loud what I believe you already know. And if I say it and you do not feel the same, then staying would be complicated for both of us." He looked at his hands, which were laced loosely between his knees. "But I have been here 3 months, and I have watched you build something on the hardest ground in this valley with your own hands and your boy's help and mine. And I have watched you face down Calhoun Marsh and deal with cracked stone and failed mortar joints and clay soil that does not want to be farmed. And I have watched you laugh and work and care for your son and this land with everything you have." He looked at her. "And I am in love with you, Harriet Merriweather. I have been for some time. And I thought you deserved to know it plainly." The night held its breath around them. The crickets went on regardless. The stars stayed where they were. Harriet looked at him for a long time, looking at his honest, careful face, his steady eyes, and she thought about the morning he had ridden up on his gray horse and said he knew every inch of this soil. And she thought about all the mornings since, all the work and the silence and the laughter and the storm. And she thought about her mother's corn growing green and improbable in the rocky clay soil of Section 14. And she thought about what it meant to take a claim on difficult ground and work it anyway. And she thought that love was something very like that. "I know you have," she said quietly. "I have known for a while." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I am not easy," she said. "I need to own my own decisions. I need to work my own land." "I know," he said. "That is part of why I love you." "And James needs—" "I know what James needs," Theodore said gently. "I have been watching him for 3 months. He needs someone consistent, someone who stays." "Can you stay?" she asked, and the question had more in it than its simple words. It was the real one, the one underneath all the rest. "I can stay," he said, with a simplicity that carried absolute conviction. "I want to stay. This land, this claim, I have told you I know every inch of it. I would like to know it for the rest of my life. With you." She reached over and took his hand, and his fingers closed around hers with a steadiness that she felt all the way through. And the night went on around them, wide and star-filled and full of cricket sound. And after a while he turned his hand over and pressed her palm to his lips, briefly, carefully, and she felt it like warmth expanding outward from the center of her chest. "Theodore," she said. "Yes. Do not leave." "I am not going anywhere," he said. They sat together on the stone step for a long time after that, her shoulder against his hand still holding hers, until the night went on toward midnight, and the coyotes called far out on the dark prairie. And she went inside, and he walked to his bedroll at the edge of the cleared ground. And the distance between those 2 points felt entirely different now than it had before, not a separation but a space that was in the process of being crossed. The next morning James woke up and found his mother humming while she made the breakfast fire, which she had not done since Indiana. And Theodore arrived from across the clearing with his hat in one hand and his hair damp from the creek, and a smile that he did not appear to be managing with his usual careful restraint. James looked at both of them with his 9-year-old clarity and said, "Good," with enormous satisfaction, and poured himself a cup of coffee that was mostly hot water and went to check on the corn. They spoke to him together later that morning, both of them sitting at the rough-hewn table Theodore had made in June from cottonwood timber, and Harriet told James what had passed between them and asked him how he felt about it with the same directness she had always brought to the hard conversations with her son, treating him as someone whose feelings were real and mattered. James listened carefully and then said, "Mr. Easton, do you intend to tell my mother what to do?" Theodore met this with the gravity it deserved. "No," he said. "I intend to work alongside her and argue with her when I think she is wrong and be told when she is right and ask her to decide the things that need deciding because this is her claim." James nodded. "All right," he said. "I think you should probably call her Harriet." Theodore looked at Harriet. Harriet pressed her lips together over a smile. "I think so too," she said. Calhoun Marsh made one more attempt in August, this time sending 2 of his hired men out to the east fence line to cut the wire and drive a portion of his herd through, which was a claim jumper's trick as old as the range itself. The idea being that if your livestock grazed someone's claimed land long enough and frequently enough, you could muddy the improvement record and challenge their residency claim in court. Theodore discovered the cut wire before the cattle had grazed far, and he and Harriet confronted the situation with a combination of Theodore's plain, firm dealing with the hired men, who were mostly embarrassed by the business and did not argue seriously, and Harriet's immediate ride into Caldwell to file a formal complaint with the county land office, and with Theodore's advice, the U.S. Marshal who came through the territory on a circuit. The Marshal, a lean, unhurried man named Calloway who had seen every variety of range war and land dispute the plains had to offer, came out to the claim, listened to both sides, inspected the cut wire, noted the evidence, and informed Calhoun Marsh in terms that were polite in form and absolute in substance that any further interference with a legal homestead claim would constitute a federal matter under the Homestead Act, and that he took a personal interest in seeing the law followed in his territory. Marsh, who was a bully and not a fool, backed down. Harriet thanked Marshal Calloway with the same plain dignity she brought to everything, and when he rode away she stood looking after him for a moment, and then she said to Theodore, "I would not have known to go to the marshal rather than just the county office." "You would have figured it out," he said. "I might have lost time figuring it out," she said. "Time I did not have." He understood what she was acknowledging, that the help had mattered, that knowing when to accept it and how to use it was its own kind of competence, and that she was choosing to name that honestly. "You would have been all right either way," he said, but he said it gently and not as a contradiction. The corn came in September, an improbable, hard-won harvest from the difficult clay soil of Section 14. Not the bounty of the rich river-bottom homesteads, but better than it had any right to be. Rows of solid ears from her mother's Indiana variety grown in Kansas soil. And when Harriet stood at the edge of the harvested field in the September light with the golden stalks cut and stacked around her, she cried for the first time since Robert had died. Not from grief, but from something more complicated, from exhaustion and pride and the persistent, slightly awed recognition that she had actually done it, that the land had yielded to her, that all of it, the filed claim and the well end, the stone walls and the planted rows and all the work of all the months had come to this, the first harvest. Theodore found her there and stood beside her without speaking, and after a moment he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him and cried a little more, and then straightened and wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, "Good harvest." "Good harvest," he agreed. "For the worst land in the valley," she said, and she was smiling. "Second worst," he said. "I think the parcel east of the ridge has it beaten." She laughed and he kept his arm around her as they walked back toward the house, and it was the first time they had moved together like that, easy and natural and without the careful management of appropriate distance, and neither of them commented on it because there was nothing to comment on. It was simply how things were now. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in October, which was both simple and not simple at all. He had waited because he understood intuitively that the timing mattered, that she needed to have her harvest in and her first real autumn on the claim settled around her before the question was asked, needed to have proven the thing to herself fully before anything else was offered. He was right about this, and the fact that he was right about it was itself a significant part of why she said yes. He did not have a ring. He told her this plainly, with an honest apology that was not apologetic in a diminishing way but simply honest. The survey work would pay in the fall and he would have money then, and they could choose something, if she wanted it. She told him she had a ring from her first marriage and did not want to wear it again, and that what she wanted, if they married, was something that belonged to this land, to this place they had built together. He went away for a few hours the next afternoon and came back with something he had made himself, a braided band of silver wire, thin wire from the fencing supplies, wound around a shaped piece of the limestone from the claim, polished smooth, set in a simple silver bezel he had fashioned with the small tools in his saddlebag. It was rough and not beautiful in any conventional sense, but it was made from the land they had both claimed in their different ways, and when he put it on her finger she looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "It is not," he began. "It is exactly right," she said. They were married in November in Caldwell, at the small Methodist church on the main street, with James standing beside them as the only witness except for the minister and his wife, and Harriet wore the best dress she owned, which was still faded but was not black, a deep blue that she had had since before Robert died, and had not worn for the year of mourning, and which she had taken out and pressed carefully the evening before. Theodore wore a clean shirt and his best coat and had shaved, and he looked at her when she came to stand beside him with an expression of such transparent and uncomplicated love that the minister's wife pressed her handkerchief to the corner of her eye. James shook Theodore's hand after the ceremony with a formal gravity that broke down almost immediately into a real and unself-conscious happiness, and Theodore clapped him on the shoulder and then bent down and hugged him, and James hugged back, and Harriet watched her son's arms go around this man who had ridden up on a gray horse in the spring morning and said he knew this soil, and she thought that there were some kinds of knowing that were not about the land at all. The winter on Section 14 was a different kind of hard from the summer, the cold coming in off the plains with a cutting directness that the thick stone walls of the house deflected, but did not eliminate entirely. They built a second room on the east side of the original structure in the first weeks of November, before the ground froze, working quickly with the cut limestone stacked from earlier clearing, and this room was the family's together properly, with the pine-framed bed Theodore had built in October, and the pieced quilt Harriet had brought from Indiana, and the small oval mirror that had been her mother's. The privacy that the second room gave them was something she had not let herself think about in advance, and the first evening they were alone in it with the lamp turned low and the winter wind pushing against the stone walls outside, she found herself both moved and somehow shy in a way that surprised her, because she was 31 years old and had been married before and was not a girl. And yet standing in the room she had built on the land she had claimed and looking at Theodore Easton, who was now her husband, there was something entirely new about it, something that had nothing to do with the first time she had been married at all. He was patient and gentle and unhurried, and the shyness dissolved, and what was between them in the winter dark of the stone room was warm and real and better than anything she had expected or allowed herself to imagine, and afterward she lay against his shoulder listening to his heartbeat and to the wind outside and felt something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten its name. Safe, not afraid, entirely, quietly, profoundly at home. "Harriet," he said in the dark. "Yes." "I am glad I rode out that morning." She pressed her hand against his chest over his heart. "So am I," she said. The winter passed in the way winters do when the work is internal, and the world is contracted to the small, warm circle of a house and a family, slowly, and with its own kind of richness. Theodore's surveying contract came through from the territorial office, and he spent the coldest weeks of January and February working on the survey documents at the table by the lamp in the evenings, while Harriet worked on the quilt she was expanding and James read or worked the arithmetic problems Theodore set him. And the lamp made a circle of light in the stone room, and the wind went on outside, and the three of them were inside it together, and it was good. James thrived, which was the word for it. There was no lesser word that would do. The look of braced, careful tension that had been in his face since his father's illness began to ease, and then to disappear altogether, replaced by the ordinary expressiveness of a 9-year-old boy who was learning things and had enough to eat and was not afraid. He and Theodore had developed a working friendship that was its own specific thing, different from a father-son relationship, and different from an adult friendship, but real and warm and grounded in the genuine mutual respect they had had from the beginning. Theodore taught him things, everything from surveying to basic carpentry to the names of the stars over the Kansas plains, and James received all of it with an appetite that was itself a joy to watch. In early March, when the snow was still lying in the north-facing hollows, but the sun was beginning to have real warmth in it, Harriet told Theodore that she was expecting. She told him in the morning, before they were out of bed, in the plain, direct way she told him most things, and there was a moment of absolute stillness before his arms tightened around her, and he said her name against her hair in a way that carried everything, joy and wonder, and a gratefulness that went deeper than words. "Are you all right?" he said after a moment, pulling back to look at her face. "I am very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but I have been here before." "I know," he said, "but this is different from the last time." "In every way," she agreed. She watched something cross his face that she recognized as the specific worry of a man who has known loss and knows better than to take anything for granted, and she touched his face with her hand and said, "Theodore, I am healthy. The baby will be healthy. And we have a well and a stone house and a harvest's worth of corn stored in the barn, and we are going to be fine." He covered her hand with his, pressing it against his cheek, and looked at her with all of it showing on his face, the love and the hope and the careful, precious fear that comes with caring deeply about something. "Yes," he said, "we are going to be fine." She told James that afternoon. He processed this information with his characteristic thoroughness, asking a number of practical questions about how a baby would fit in the house and whether a baby would require most of her attention. And when these were addressed to his satisfaction, he said, with a careful, hopeful quality, "Will it be my brother or my sister?" "We will not know until it comes," Harriet said. "I would prefer a brother," James said, "but I will be satisfied with either." "That is very generous of you," Theodore said from across the table with a straight face. James considered him. "I learned it from you," he said. Theodore looked at his wife over James's head, and the private look between them was all warmth and shared, helpless amusement, and something that was nothing other than happiness. Spring came back to Section 14, the second time, with a familiarity that was entirely different from the first arrival. The land was known to them now, every rock and hollow and wet patch and dry patch, the particular angle the morning light hit the ridge to the north, the way the creek sound changed in April when the snowmelt came down from the higher ground, the places where the wild plum grew along the fence line, and the places where the meadowlarks nested in the grass. The second planting went in with the confidence of people who had done this before and knew what the ground would give. They doubled the corn acreage, having amended the soil in a second section through the winter by composting and spreading, and Theodore had procured winter wheat seed from a merchant in Caldwell who had gotten it from settlers in the northern part of the territory, and the wheat went in on the northern slope where the drainage was better, an experiment that Theodore said might work and might not but was worth attempting. The wheat worked. It came up in May and thin, even rows that by June were knee-high and golden-tinged, and the sight of it on the rocky slope where nothing but scrub grass had grown before was remarkable enough that a neighbor from 2 claims over, a German farmer named Albrecht who had been skeptical of the Merriweather-Easton claim since its beginning, rode out and stood at the fence line and stared at it for a full 5 minutes before removing his hat in a gesture that was both a greeting and an acknowledgement. "Good wheat," Albrecht said eventually. "Good soil if you work it right," Theodore said. Albrecht looked at the wheat and then at the stone house and then at the established corn rows below and then at Harriet, who was standing at the edge of the field with her pregnancy showing clearly now under her practical working clothes, and he said something in German to himself and then said in English, "We thought this land was no good." "It is difficult land," Harriet said. "That is not the same thing." Albrecht looked at her for a moment and then he smiled, a broad, reluctant smile. "No," he said. "I am learning this." He became a good neighbor after that. And his wife, a stout and capable woman named Gertrude, came to visit in June with a basket of preserved fruits and a practical warmth that asked no unnecessary questions, and offered its friendship without conditions. And she and Harriet developed an easy, working friendship that was immensely valuable to both of them, a thing of exchanged knowledge and shared labor, and the particular comfort of another woman's company in a landscape that could be lonely. Gertrude had delivered 3 of her own children and assisted at several more in the community. And when she and Harriet talked frankly about the coming birth, Harriet felt the particular relief of competent help already arranged. The question that had been quietly concerning her resolved. The summer was hot again, as Kansas summers are always hot, but this year the heat was managed with the easy familiarity of the experienced rather than the desperate energy of the first season. The well held, the crops grew. The stone house kept them cool in the worst of the afternoons. James turned 10 in July, and Theodore built him a workbench in the barn and gave him a set of basic carpentry tools. And the sound of James's enthusiastic and imprecise efforts with these tools became a regular feature of the summer evenings, punctuated by Theodore's patient, clear corrections and occasional bursts of laughter from both of them at some disaster or another. Harriet watched this from the kitchen doorway many evenings, feeling the baby move inside her, watching her son and her husband at the workbench in the barn's golden late light, and the completeness of what she felt in those moments was something she did not have precise language for. It was too large and too quiet at once. It was the feeling of a life that fit, that belonged to itself, that had been built on hard ground with honest effort, and had become something real and solid and full. She went into labor on a Tuesday morning in late August, a hard day, the kind that comes at the end of summer when the heat is at its most insistent. Gertrude arrived within an hour of the message James carried at a hard run to the Albrecht claim, arriving slightly breathless and entirely competent. And Theodore took James out to the barn and kept him occupied with the workbench, and was himself occupied with the white-knuckled effort of a man who loves someone and is waiting to hear she is all right, which is one of the harder things a person can do. The labor was 8 hours, which was harder than the first time but not alarming, and at 3 in the afternoon Harriet delivered a boy, a large, red-faced, loudly vocal boy with his mother's brown hair and his father's gray-green eyes, which would not be visible for some months but which Harriet already somehow knew. Theodore came in when Gertrude called him and stood at the bedside and looked at his son and then at Harriet, and his face did the thing that faces do at moments too large for them. It went very still and very bright at once, and he took Harriet's hand and did not say anything at all for a considerable time. James appeared in the doorway behind him, not having waited to be called with perfect predictability, and looked at the baby with the measured assessment of a 10-year-old boy. "He is very small," James said. "He will be bigger," Theodore said without turning around. "He is very loud," James said. "He will be quieter," Harriet said, though this was somewhat optimistic. James came to stand beside the bed and looked at the baby more closely. "What is his name?" he said. Harriet looked at Theodore. They had talked about names over the last months, with the tentative, careful quality of people who do not want to count on a thing too much before it arrives, but they had come to something. "William," Harriet said. "William Robert Easton." The Robert was for James's father, and James understood this immediately, and something passed over his face that was complex and right, grief and gratitude, and the recognition that his mother held all of this together, the past and the present, without letting either cancel the other. "That is a good name," James said, with great seriousness. Theodore put his arm around James's shoulders, and the 3 of them, the 4 of them, were gathered in the stone room of the house on Section 14 in the late August afternoon, and outside the window the wheat field on the northern slope stood in its second season gold, and the corn was coming in for the second harvest, and the well was cold and full, and the stone walls held the heat out and the family in, and it was exactly what it had always been, the hardest land in the valley, and it was home. William Robert Easton was a colicky baby who slept in emphatic disagreement with the schedule his parents would have preferred, and the autumn of his first year was a tired and somewhat disheveled season in the Easton household. Theodore, who had lived alone for the better part of 15 years and was accustomed to uninterrupted sleep, adapted to this reality with the same patient pragmatism he brought to everything, though Harriet did catch him once standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning with William on his shoulder, and his eyes closed, not asleep, but not quite awake either, swaying gently in a half-conscious rhythm that was both helpless and completely devoted. She had stood in the doorway watching this for a moment before he heard her and turned, and the expression on his face when he saw her standing there watching him, tired and rumpled and holding their son in the lamplight, was the expression of a man who knows himself to be exactly where he belongs and is still slightly astonished by his own luck. "Go back to bed," he said softly. "I have him." "You are half asleep," she said. "I am a third asleep," he said, "which is enough." She crossed the room and kissed him carefully, not wanting to disturb William, who had finally quieted against Theodore's shoulder, and he kissed her back with one arm, the one not holding the baby, pulling her briefly close, and then she went back to bed and slept for 3 uninterrupted hours, which felt, in that exhausted season, like absolute luxury. The third year on Section 14 established the Easton claim as one of the more productive operations in the valley, which surprised everyone except Theodore and Harriet themselves. The wheat had proven itself on the northern slope, and they expanded it in the third year, adding 2 additional fields on the cleared limestone sections that Theodore had been amending for 2 seasons. The corn was steady and reliable, her mother's Indiana variety proving equal to the Kansas clay with the right soil management. They had added 3 pigs and a small flock of chickens in the second year, and a second mule, and by the third year the barn had taken on the organized, purposeful character of a working farm center. Theodore's survey work continued through the spring and fall contracts, and the money from those contracts, modest but steady, gave them a cushion that grew slowly into a kind of security, the kind that does not make a person comfortable but makes them able to look at difficulty without flinching. Harriet ran the books, as she had always run the books, with the methodical precision her father had taught her, and every expense was noted and every income was counted, and the margins were thin but they were margins. Calhoun Marsh sold his cattle operation in the winter of 1876 to a consortium from Missouri, having apparently decided that the combination of bad beef prices, a hard winter, and the increasing number of established homesteads in the valley had made his expansion plans impractical. He left the territory without ceremony and without speaking to any of the homesteaders directly, and his departure was noted by the valley community with a collective sense of relief that nobody had to articulate. James turned 12 in the summer of 1877 and had grown into a boy that his mother looked at with a steady, warm pride that had nothing of surprise in it, because she had always known who he was, had always seen him clearly, but the version of him that emerged from those years on Section 14 was better than even her best hopes. He was literate and numerate well above his years, thanks to his mother's insistence on daily lessons and Theodore's supplementary teaching, and he had a practical knowledge of land and surveying and construction that most grown men in the territory would have envied. He was also kind, with the specific, unfussy kindness of someone who has learned it from watching rather than from being lectured about it. And he was easy with William in the particular way of an older sibling who has accepted the interruption of his singular status and discovered in the younger child something unexpectedly interesting. The summer of 1877 brought a new challenge to the valley in the form of a drought that settled in at the beginning of June and did not lift until late September. The creek went dry in May, a month earlier than usual, and the well, their reliable cold well at 17 feet, began to show the strain by the middle of July, the water level dropping for the first time since they had dug it. The wheat was the hardest hit, the second-year fields on the limestone sections where the soil was shallowest beginning to show the pale yellow of serious stress by mid-July. Theodore and Harriet made the decision together, in the way they always made decisions, sitting at the table with the books open, and the field maps between them and the honest numbers laid out without sentimentality. They would sacrifice the second-year wheat fields if it came to it, concentrating the well water on the corn and the first-year wheat on the better soil. And they would plant winter rye in the abandoned sections in the fall when the rains came back, as rye was drought-tolerant, and would begin the process of rebuilding the soil for the following season. It was hard, watching the wheat in the shallow fields go yellow, and then brown and then past saving. Hard in the specific way that it is always hard to watch something you built and tended fail, even when you know it is the right decision. Harriet walked those fields in the evenings with William on her hip, because he was nearly 3 and was at the stage of being put down and immediately running in whatever direction was most inconvenient. And she walked the dead wheat rows and felt the texture of the brittle stalks and the dust that had been soil. And she thought about the woman who had come to this valley 3 years ago with $14 and a crooked hat. And she thought that losing 2 fields of wheat to a drought was a loss she could carry. Because it was the kind of loss that could be answered, that could be worked around and built through. And that was the difference between difficult and impossible, and she had always known the difference. Theodore found her in the dead wheat field one evening near the end of July, William on her hip and the sunset going red over the ridge, and he came to stand beside her the way he always came, not rushing anything, not offering anything she had not asked for, just present. "The corn is holding," he said. "I know," she said. "I walked it this morning." "The first-year wheat too," he said. "The root depth is better there, it will make it." "I know," she said again. She looked at the dead field. "We will plant rye in October." "Yes," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, William squirming between them in the way of toddlers who do not like being restricted, and Theodore put his free arm around her, and they stood in the dead wheat field in the Kansas evening, and the drought went on around them, and they held on, which was itself a kind of answer. The rains came back in late September, as they nearly always do on the plains after a summer drought, not gently but dramatically, a series of hard storms that dropped more water in 3 weeks than the valley had seen in 6 months. The corn harvest came in light but sufficient. The first-year wheat came in at 2/3 of a normal yield, which was considerably better than it might have been, and they planted winter rye in the failed fields before the ground froze, and it took the fall moisture and greened up bravely in the October cool. Winter of 1877 into 1878 was easier than the previous 2, not because it was less cold, but because they were better prepared, more experienced, more supplied. The storm cellar Theodore had dug in the second year stocked with enough preserved food to see them comfortably through even a hard winter. James was given charge of the livestock records that winter, a responsibility he accepted with a seriousness that made Theodore exchange a private smile with Harriet over his head. And William, 3 years old and opinionated about nearly everything, began talking in full and complicated sentences that revealed a personality that was both his own and uncannily a distillation of both his parents, direct and persistent and deeply interested in how things worked. In March of 1878, Harriet told Theodore she was expecting again. She told him in the morning, before they were out of bed, in the plain way she had told him the first time, and this time he did not have the white-knuckled worry of a man facing something entirely new. He had the steady, warm, experienced happiness of a man who knows what this brings. He told her he loved her, which he told her regularly and without occasion, and then he asked if she was well, and she said she was very well, and he held her in the early morning light of the stone room that they had built on the hardest land in the valley, and the world outside was still and cold, and the rye on the northern slope was under its last coat of winter snow and would push up green in April, and the well was cold and deep and full, and the claim was 5 years old come spring. Which meant the title, the full legal deed to 160 acres of Section 14, would transfer to Harriet Merriweather Easton at the filing office in Caldwell in a matter of weeks. She went to the land office in April of 1878, the same Caldwell land office where she had laid down $14 in coins 4 years earlier, though Gerald Hooper had retired and been replaced by a younger man named Willis who was more efficient and less theatrical. She brought Theodore and James with her and left William with Gertrude Albrecht, because a 3-year-old in a government office was a specific kind of challenge that she did not need on a significant day. Willis processed the final transfer with the brisk efficiency of someone who did this regularly, but even he paused for a moment when he looked up from the deed to hand it to her, because there was something in the quality of her attention as she received it that made the moment feel larger than the routine of his office. The deed read, Harriet M. Easton, Section 14, 160 acres, full title, fee simple, Sumner County, Kansas, 1878. Her name, her land. She stood outside the land office on the Caldwell Main Street with the deed in her hands, and the April wind warm in her face, and Theodore beside her and James on her other side. And she read her name on the deed one more time, slowly. Theodore said nothing, because he knew her well enough to know that this was a moment that belonged to her alone, that he had helped build the thing it represented, but the claiming of it was hers, had always been hers, from the moment she laid $14 on Gerald Hooper's counter in the knowledge that everyone in that room thought she was making a mistake. James put his hand over hers, both of them on the deed, in the particular gesture of a 12-year-old boy who has grown up in the company of his mother's strength and wants to acknowledge it without being able to put it into words. Harriet looked at the deed, and then at her son, and then at her husband, whose eyes held everything she had come to know in them, the steadiness and the warmth and the love that had shown up on a gray horse on a spring morning and said it knew every inch of this soil and had stayed to prove it, and had become, in the proving, something she had never expected and could not imagine living without. Well, she said. Well, Theodore said. It is ours, James said. It is ours, she agreed. They rode home along the valley road in the April afternoon, the same road she had driven that first morning with her 2 trunks and her tool crate and her mother's seed corn. And the valley was green on either side with the new season, the established homesteads solid and purposeful along the better land, and at the far end of the valley where the land began to slope up toward the limestone ridge, Section 14 lay in its improbable, rocky, impossible, entirely alive beauty. The winter rye green on the northern slope, the plowed fields waiting for the corn, the stone house square and solid in its hollow, the smoke from the morning's banked fire still faint against the blue sky. She was carrying her second child, and her first child was driving the wagon, and her husband was beside her on the gray horse, a different gray horse now, the original having retired to easy pasture work 4 years ago, but a good horse, a steady horse, and Theodore rode it the way he rode everything, with the easy, confident competence of a man comfortable in his own body and in the world around him. They came home to the smell of Gertrude's cooking, because Gertrude had stayed with William and had apparently also made dinner with the efficiency of a woman who believed firmly that good food was the appropriate response to most significant occasions. And William launched himself at his father from the doorway with the faith of a 3-year-old who has never doubted that he will be caught, and was caught. And Theodore swung him up onto his shoulder, and William clutched his father's hair with complete disregard for the inconvenience of this and said, "What did you bring me?" "A deed to 160 acres, Theodore said. William considered this. "I wanted candy," he said. "William," James said, with the tolerant long-suffering of an older sibling, "you do not even know what a deed is." "I know what candy is," William said. Harriet covered her mouth over a laugh that came up from somewhere helpless and deep, and Theodore caught her eye over their son's head, and his own face broke open in the fullness of it, the happiness and the absurdity and the love, all of it at once, undivided, complete. Gertrude's dinner was excellent, and the evening was warm, and the lamp made its circle of light in the stone room, and William fell asleep at the table in the unself-conscious way of small children, and was carried to bed by his father, and James sat up a while longer going over the livestock records with the dedication he had been giving them all winter, and Harriet sat in the chair by the window with the deed on the table beside her and her hand on her belly where the new life moved. And the night over Section 14 was wide and full of stars. Theodore came back from putting William down and stopped in the doorway of the room, looking at her in the lamp light, the deed on the table, her hand on the curve of her pregnancy, the window with the stars beyond it. "You are thinking," he said. "I am always thinking," she said. "You are thinking in particular," he said, and came to sit beside her. She looked at the deed and then out the window and then at him. "I am thinking," she said slowly, "about the woman who came into that office with $14 and a crooked hat and filed a claim on the worst land in the valley because it was the only option left." She paused. She had no idea. "She had more idea than she knew," Theodore said, which was exactly the right thing to say, which was typical of him. "She did not know about you," Harriet said. "No," Theodore agreed. "Neither did I, for that matter." He reached over and took her hand, the one with the limestone and silver ring on it, the ring from the land, from this ground they had built their life on together. "I rode out that morning thinking about soil composition and drainage, and whether you had any idea what you had filed on." "And," she said, "and I found out within about 10 minutes that you knew exactly what you had filed on," he said, "and that you were going to do it whether anyone helped you or not." "I would have," she said. "I know," he said. "That is when I decided I would very much like to help." She leaned over and kissed him carefully, in the way of people who have been together long enough that a kiss can be many things, and this one was warmth and gratitude and the specific tenderness of two people who have built something hard and true and lasting together. Outside the stone house on the hardest land in the valley, the Kansas night went on in its ancient, unbothered way, the stars turning above the limestone ridge, the rye sleeping in the dark earth of the northern slope, the well holding its cold water at 17 feet, the fence lines running straight and sure along the section boundaries. And the claim that had been filed on a spring morning in 1874 by a widow with a crooked hat, and $14 lay settled and real and alive beneath the wide dark sky, rooted now in all the ways that mattered, in the law and in the soil, and in the life that had grown up from it like something planted with great care in difficult ground and tended. Through every hard season until it came into its own, improbable and enduring and entirely, completely home. The baby girl came in October, born on the first cold day of the autumn with the cottonwoods along the creek going yellow and the smell of the harvest still in the air. She was small and dark-haired and quiet, nothing like William had been at his arrival, and she looked at the world from her first hour in it with large, dark eyes of a particular thoughtful intensity that made Theodore say, softly, that she was already thinking more clearly than most adults he knew. They named her Clara Frances Easton, the Frances for Theodore's mother, and James held her in the lamplight with the solemn wonder of a boy who has understood that he has just watched something important happen. And William, 4 years old and of strong opinions, announced that she was very small and he had hoped for a dog instead, but then spent the rest of the afternoon sitting as close to her as he was allowed and watching her with an attention that was, whatever he said, entirely captivated. And so the years laid themselves down on Section 14. One after another, each one adding something, the farm expanding gradually and carefully as they learned what the land would give and what it would not, the stone house growing a second extension when the children needed it, the wheat fields established and reliable on the improved northern slope, the corn a steady, faithful annual presence in the southern basin. Theodore's survey contracts continued each spring and fall, taking him away for stretches that Harriet managed with the self-sufficiency that was as natural to her as breathing, and he always came back to the valley road, and the sight of the stone house in its hollow and the smoke from the chimney came back with the specific, particular happiness of a man returning to something he chose freely every single time. James grew into himself through those years in the way that good people grow, not dramatically but steadily, becoming more fully and clearly who he had always been. By the time he was 16, he was doing a man's work on the farm with a man's competence, and his interest in surveying, nurtured by Theodore across years of evening lessons and occasional field trips, had become a serious ambition. He was corresponding with a surveying firm in Wichita by the time he was 17, and when he was 19, Theodore helped him secure a position with a territorial survey crew, and the morning James rode away down the valley road toward his own life was both proud and hard, as those mornings always are. But he came back. Not to stay, but to visit, which was different and better in its way. The returning of someone who has gone out and found himself and comes back to the place he came from with the particular love of someone who chose it rather than just inherited it. William, who was not quiet like Clara or serious like James, but loud and curious and possessed of an energy that sometimes seemed to operate on a different fuel source from the rest of the family, found his own footing on the farm in the way that middle children sometimes do, by becoming the one who knew how to make everyone laugh, and also, unexpectedly, by developing a gift for growing things that exceeded even Harriet's considerable talent. By the time he was 12, he had taken over the kitchen garden entirely and expanded it into something that drew admiring comments from every neighbor who came to the farm, and the German farmer Albrecht, who was getting old by then and had become one of their closest friends, said that the boy had the instincts of someone who understood what the earth wanted, which was the highest compliment he knew how to give. Clara was her father's particular joy and her mother's particular puzzle, because she combined Theodore's quiet intelligence with a stubbornness that exceeded even Harriet's own, which was saying something considerable. She asked questions about everything, the sky and the rocks and the water and the people who had lived on this land before them, the questions that do not have easy answers, and she had the patience to sit with the hard ones rather than settling for a comfortable answer. Theodore said she would either be a teacher or a judge, and Harriet thought he was probably right about both. The 5th-year anniversary of the claim, which had already been marked by the deed transfer, was also marked by something smaller and more personal, by Harriet and Theodore sitting on the stone step of the house on a spring evening, the same step they had sat on the night he told her he loved her, and looking out over the valley in the long last light. The valley had changed around them, more homesteads established, more land under cultivation, the distant sound of Caldwell grown from a rough cattle trade town to something with more permanence in its architecture and its ambitions. The West was changing as it always had been changing. As Theodore said once, the frontier was not a place but a moment, and moments always passed, and what came after was what you built while the moment was yours. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him, though she knew the answer. "Which part?" he said. "Any of it," she said. "All of it." He looked at her, at the face he had watched change through 4 years and 2 children, and every season the Kansas plains could offer, at the woman who had laid $14 on a counter and claimed the hardest land in the valley, and then refused to let it be as hard as everyone said it was. "Not 1 hour of it," he said, and took her hand, and meant it with every particular detail of himself. The crickets started up as the light failed, and the cottonwoods along the creek made their soft, familiar sound, and the stone house stood solid behind them with the lamplight beginning to show warm in the windows as Clara lit the evening lamp the way she had been trusted to do since she was 5. And somewhere inside William was talking at a volume that suggested James had come home for a visit, because that was the volume William reserved for his brother's presence, and the sound of it. James's laugh and William's insistent voice and Clara's occasional precise interjection was the best sound that Harriet Merriweather Easton had ever heard in the 40 years of her life. She leaned against Theodore's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the evening settled over Section 14, over the limestone ridge and the well and the wheat slope and the corn fields and the stone house with its warm windows, over the hardest land in the valley that had been none of the things people said it was, and all of the things she had always known it could be, and over the two people who had found each other on it in the simple, sufficient, entirely extraordinary way that the best things happen. Not through grand design, but through a gray horse on a spring morning and $14 counted out one coin at a time, and a man who said he knew every inch of this soil and a woman who took that at its word. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.